I will now show you how to nest statements inside other statements and how to properly indent your code so as to be able to see those nestings properly. So nesting can be done for a for loop inside a for loop, for example, or an if statement inside a for loop, or a for loop inside an if statement, or an if statement inside an if statement, and so forth. As always, let's begin with an example. Suppose we wanted to have the user enter a number and then print out all odd numbers that are between 0 and strictly less than that number. So in order to do that, we need a variable. Let's say that's the number that the user enters. Let's call it target. And we should ask the user to please enter a target number. And then we can read that from the user input with a scanf. We're going to use a %d because it's an integer, and we're going to store the result in target. Now that we have that number, we want to print out all odd numbers between 0 and strictly less than the target number. So if the user entered something negative, there's really absolutely nothing to do. So that's the first thing we should check. If target is greater than or equal to 0, well, then we're going to do something. So let's put our braces there, and let's leave that open for now. Otherwise, else, there's really nothing to do. So we'll just print out nothing to do. All right, so let's go back up here. In the case where the user did enter something positive, we want to go through all odd numbers less than the target number and print them out. How do we do that? We could use a for loop. We could say we look through all integers that are less than target and check whether they're odd, and if so, print them out. So we need a loop counter right here. And then we can use a for loop. We initialize I from 0 while I is less than target, because we only want to check those numbers that are strictly less than our target number, and we want to increase I by 1. And so there's our loop. And inside the loop, all we need to do is check whether I is an odd number, and if so, print it out. Then we will have checked all numbers that are strictly less than the target number and printed out those amongst those numbers that are odd. There are other ways to do this. We could have simply started our loop at 1, which actually is an odd number, and always increased it by 2 and avoided the if statement inside the for loop. But because it's nice to nest another if inside the for, which is already nested inside the if, and this whole code casted by the nesting, that's why I'm using this more cumbersome way of solving this task. All right, so we need to check whether I is odd, and if so, print it out. How do we do that? If. How do we check whether a number is odd? Well, if you divide it by 2 and there's a remainder, then the number is odd. How do we get the remainder in division by 2? It's the modulo operator. So the remainder when dividing by 2 can be either 0 or 1. If it's 0, the number is even, we don't want to print it out. If it's 1, the number is odd, and we do print it out. So I mod 2 gives us 1 if the number is odd. And in that case, we do want to print it out. So I mod 2 is the if statement that we actually want right here. So if I mod 2, that has the value 1, well, then we want to print out this number %d. And let's print them all next to each other. So let's put a space next to it. I. And that's all we need to do. That's the program. Let's compile this and run this. Please enter a target number, let's say 17, and it printed out the numbers from 1 through 15, to 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15. So the program works. Let's go back to edit mode and look at how indenting happens pretty much automatically through the editor. What we see here, for example, is that the opening brace for my if statement has a matching closing brace that is right underneath this if statement. And that is for clarity purposes, so you can easily track where this if statement ends. The code would be just as correct if I had put that closing brace right there, but the code would be harder to read. It would execute just as fine. I could compile and run and nothing would change. But it's not very visually easy to read the code that way, so I'm going to re-indent it. Next, we notice that this entire for loop that is sitting inside the if statement has been indented. The for is much farther to the right than the if was. Any statement inside the if statement, inside these braces here, has been indented so that we can read easily, oh, this is all only inside the if statement. And so this for loop also has its own opening brace right here with a matching closing brace that is underneath the for loop, again for easy visualization of what's happening. Everything inside this for loop is indented so that we can see easily this is the code that's inside the for loop. And for this if statement right here, it has an opening brace and its matching closing brace, again, right underneath the if statement. Anything inside the if statement is indented. So whenever you have a for loop or an if statement or something like that, what goes inside is indented. Similarly, for this else statement right here, it has an opening brace and a matching closing brace right underneath, and what's inside is indented. Altogether, the further a structure is nested inside other structures, like this if statement is pretty far inside here, the further to the right it will appear. There's another way of placing braces, and whichever way you choose is kind of up to you in whichever way you prefer. Let me demonstrate what this other way is. You see this opening brace right here for the if statement? Some people prefer to put that right underneath the if statement. So I hit return right before the brace, and it placed itself automatically right underneath this if statement. So that way, the if statement, its opening brace, and its closing brace, they're all lined up with each other. Similarly, you would then place this opening brace with the else statement there. You would even place the else statement on its own line. And that's the opening brace and the closing brace. So the if, its braces, the else, and its braces, they're all placed in the same column with respect to each other. Everything inside is indented. Similarly, for the for loop right here, I place the cursor right in front of it and hit return, which places the brace underneath this for loop. So the for loop and its opening brace, they're now lined up with each other along with this closing brace. And similarly for this if statement right here, I can put that opening brace right underneath it along with its closing brace. So that's a personal preference of what you prefer. I could even do that with this opening brace for the main function, which has its closing brace matching right down there. The code did get a little longer, but some people prefer to be able to really match braces really easily that way because they see the opening brace and the closing brace right underneath each other along with a statement that they belong to. The editor also further helps. So you already saw that when I hit return, the brace put itself in the right place automatically. The opening brace and the closing brace shows up automatically. Another helpful thing is that if you put a cursor right after a brace, for example, this closing brace right here, the corresponding brace, which you see up here, the corresponding brace is actually put inside a little box. And so you see what the matching corresponding brace is. The same were to happen if I put the cursor behind this opening brace, then the corresponding closing brace shows up in a little box. So the editor tries to help in every which way to help you place braces and structures with good style in your code so that it's easy to read your code. It's easier to avoid errors that way. So there are these two ways of placing your braces, and you get to choose whichever one you prefer.